Today, we become legends.
Today's Titan Talk had Pon as a guest and went over the full balance notes for OB12, as well as some improvements to the action camera, questions about reworked god kits returning as aspects, and a whole lot more. Don't forget to drop a like and subscribe for more recaps if you find these useful, but with that said, let's jump in. So let's kick things off with the balance changes for OB12, and there's quite a bit coming with this update. Pon kicked things off with a brief overview of some high-level goals of what they're looking at right now. The first one was strength ability junglers are generally underperforming. There are some exceptions, of course, but on the whole, they are the weakest archetype in the game by the numbers. They also think crit is generally in a good place, but other builds aren't being explored too much, which sounds to me like crit is staying as it is, but other build options like on-hit shred or ability-based ADC being buffed up to match crit. Pon also said that they're aware of junglers at a high level getting a little too much farm in the early game, which with a buff to their items could make them very oppressive, so they're also adjusting the pacing of jungle farming early on to help alleviate some of those moments where like the jungler hits level 5 when everyone else is level 3, for example. But let's move into the individual changes. First up, all of these items are just getting 5 more strength to bump up their power level a little bit in jungle builds. Not all of these items are strictly jungle focused, and there are a few non-jungler strength items in here as well, just to bump up strength builds in general, but most of these are aimed at the jungle. There were also some items that got similar changes, but were a bit more than just 5 extra strength, so here's the rest of those. Roller's Ruin got 5 strength, but also a 50 gold cost reduction. Avenging Blade got 50 more health. Avatar's Parachute got 10 more strength. Bloodforge got a 50 gold cost reduction. Heartseeker got the 5 strength, but also an increased max health scaling on the damage from 2.5% to 3% of strength. And Transcendence's mana to strength conversion went up from 2% to 3%, which is a pretty big deal. That's an extra 9 strength just from the base item itself, with more than that if you have other mana items in your build, which you almost will always have somewhere. With Hydras and Heartseeker in the build, for example, it's about an extra 14 strength. Moving on from the jungler slash strength buffs though, next up for the group balance changes, we have some shield nerfs, which were sorely needed. Phantom Shell's shield per level is going down from 15 to 10, so 100 less at level 20, and the duration is going down from 4 seconds to 3. Selflessness and Heroism are both receiving a similar change, where they now have some base shield but have a lower max health contribution. 25 base and 5% down from 8% on Selflessness, and 50 base and 10% down from 15% on Heroism. Even with the base shield, this should make them a lot weaker at all stages of the game, but especially late game. In Heroism's case, if you have 4k HP, which is reasonable at a full support build, you're losing 200 but gaining 50 for a total of 150 less shield. They also buffed some of the shield counter items in this patch as well, with Mystical Mail no longer dealing full damage to shields regardless of range, but instead just removing 25% of active shields every tick, as well as Erosion now being able to stack its protection buff twice for a total of 20% bonus protections if 2 shields go off near you. Moving into more general item changes though, first up we have Cersei's Hexstone, which is losing 50 health, getting a 10-second cooldown increase to the active, and a fix to its description to clarify that the item doesn't have movement speed. Apparently it never did, but just said that it did. Pon said they're willing to go further with nerfs to this item if necessary, as it's being seen 2, 3, or 4 times on a team right now, but they want to make sure it remains a viable option in the absence of combat blink. Dreamer's Idol is getting a buff, going from 125 base int to 140. That's definitely a lot, a nice buff for sure, but I still don't see this item being super useful when Rod gives the same percent boost permanently. Maybe there's a meta where you get both of these, I guess, but I do feel like buffing the active boost rather than the base int would be a better way to go, as it's just kind of the same as Rod right now, but only for 10 seconds. Eye of the Storm is getting a nerf as well, thank god, with its Vortex strength going down from 150 to 120. They also reduced the Vortex fighting penalty, which is essentially a slow applied to you if you're trying to walk out of the Vortex. This has been reduced from 5% to 0%, so it should be quite a bit easier to walk out of the Vortex now. And they also increased the self-damage that the item does to you while it's active from 4% max health per second to 6%. Spectral Armor is getting a bit of a mini rework. It's losing 20 physical protection but gaining 250 health, and they finally gave in and made it just reduce crit damage instead of reducing crit chance now, so this item will be much more consistent against crit users. The larger focus on health is also better against crit users, as they don't have as much shred or kin size in their build, and you'll feel less bad buying this into magical matchups now as well. Good changes overall. That's it for items though. Let's move on to god balance for OB12. First up is Achilles, who's getting some buffs to his 2, with the strength and protection bonuses now being flat at the max rank value instead of before where it was increasing per rank, and the CCR will now increase per rank from 20% to 30% when it was just 20% flat before. Amaterasu is getting some buffs, with her 1's movement speed going up by 2% at all ranks, and the heal intelligence scaling on the 1 also going up up from 5% to 6.5% per tick. Her ultimate is also getting 10% more int scaling per hit, but this does of course increase to 1.2x and 1.4x damage on the second and third hit, so a total of 36% more int scaling on the ultimate if you land all 3 hits. No slouch by any means. Geb is getting some small buffs as well, with his rollout slow now being 2 seconds at all ranks instead of 1 second scaling up to 2. His 3's cooldown is being reduced from 17 seconds flat to 15, which is a pretty big deal, and his ultimate is getting a small base damage increase as well. Rama is getting some love for both base and aspect, with his 3's bonus damage on the auto attack going up by 15 base damage at all ranks and 10% scaling, as well as his ultimate damage going up by the same amount. Hitting all 3 shots of the ult does 255% of the base damage listed here though, so it is a bit of a bigger buff than it looks like if you can hit all your shots. Sobek Aspect is getting some buffs as well, with his 3 now dealing bonus damage to jungle monsters, dealing 70 to 215 plus 30% before. It's now dealing 100 to 260 plus 60%, so a bit more of a reason to try Aspect jungle Sobek. Uller is getting quite a few buffs as well, which makes sense. He's pretty bad at the moment in general, but also can't really use the crit build, so he's especially bad at the moment. These buffs, alongside spectral buffs and buffs to his item pool, could be pretty big for him when combined, I think. He's getting 5% more scaling on the axe, 10% more scaling on his jump, and 5 more strength at all ranks, and 2 up to 6% more lifesteal depending on rank for his ultimate passive benefits. And finally for the buffs, Yamoja is getting another buff, with her 1's damage going up by 10 to 30 depending on rank, and proportionally increased on the small bubbles as well, plus the slow has been increased from 1 second duration to 1.4. There are also a few nerfs coming to top junglers in this patch though, as they felt like they needed to nerf some of the top junglers that are already strong, considering they are buffing their entire item pool, which makes sense. Awilix is getting a small base damage nerf to her ultimate, as well as a fairly sizable strength nerf in the later ranks of the ability, hurting her follow-up after ulting, especially with a crit build, which we have seen making the rounds a little bit recently. Hunbats is also taking a few nerfs, with 10% scaling decrease to his 2 and 3. Notably, this doesn't affect Aspect Bats 2 though, which is interesting, because that's kind of the way he's played more often at the moment. Overall, fairly good changes though, in my opinion. I like the shield nerfs, though heroism might need a little more. Strength jungler buffs are good, alongside nerfing the top junglers preemptively, which is a smart move. No crit nerfs, but the new spectral armor will be a lot stronger, so at least tank players will do better into crit, which is sort of the intent there anyway. If you go crit, you're supposed to have worse tank shred and better squishy burst. However, I do think there's a few glaring things that are missing right now from these notes, like Kali, Neith, and Aladdin nerfs, along with maybe another look at Barry and Scylla, plus Zeus and Hades potentially. In terms of items, I think Ronan Tahuti needs something, probably a cost increase or a passive revert back down to 20%. Deso could use maybe a small int nerf in my opinion. His passive is insane, but I'd personally keep the passive strong and not have it also offer some of the highest int in the game. Maybe some buffs to underperforming tank items as well to get some build diversity going in tank builds. Stuff like Breastplate and Genji's getting 5 more CDR maybe to bring them in line with other CDR bomb items. And maybe Mantle of Discord buffs to bring it in line with similar items like Spirit Robe and Freya's Tears that are just way better at the moment. Maybe even a small Dwarven Plate buff too, as it's never really built when Draconic Scale and Freya's Tears exist and do the same job better. Overall, not a bad patch though, just a few things missing that could still be looked at in my opinion. That's it for the balance changes for OB12 though. Kilgoon had a few things to mention that they didn't showcase on Monday for OB12. The first one being that self-healing in the post-match lobby will now count lifesteal, which is a great change. And they have also changed the wording of healing reduction on items to now just be called anti-healers. That's what everyone calls it in the community anyway. Horn also provided some more clarity on the action camera in the show that we got a peek into on the PTS, and they have a slightly updated version now that comes with a left offset for your character, or a right offset for the camera, I guess. I do think this looks better than it did on the PTS for sure. Still probably not something I or many people watching will ever use, but they seem convinced it will be better for new player retention, as it's much more similar to other games like Fortnite and Rivals. If that's the case, then more power to them. Anything that helps new player retention is a W in my book, and we could just ignore it as existing players if we want to. Kilgoon also mentioned that the main idea with the lower FOV is to make it easier to process and focus on what's right in front of you at the cost of seeing less stuff overall, which I can see the logic there for it helping new players, as getting into Smite there is a lot you need to pay attention to, and it might be a worthwhile trade-off for new players to laser focus on what's in front of them and less on what's going on around them, since new players kind of tunnel vision anyway, so this just lets them tunnel vision more effectively, I guess. For more experienced players though, I don't see this being a worthwhile trade-off, but it is of course optional, so it won't affect existing players at all. They also said it won't default on, or at least that's the intent. Sometimes they say these features won't default on and they do end up doing that, but the intent is that for existing players this won't default on. Someone also did ask about an FOV slider, and Pon said they're not opposed to doing that, but the maximum would probably remain at the current max zoom level. They don't want to let players go any higher than that, as things can start looking weird at very high FOVs, but they would be open to letting players lower their FOV a little bit without going full on action camera, which I think would be a nice option to have to let players find out what they like. There were also some people in chat asking for more camera options in general, and Pon said they are definitely open to that. This is just a first first pass and they can look into other options later. Someone asked when we can expect a ban increase for ranked, and Kilgoon said they might talk about that more on Friday as they are working on it, but aren't sure if it will make it into OB12, which is good to hear. 2 bans per team is getting really old at the moment with so many permabans. There was a question of if the team feels any pressure when releasing new gods to make them complicated or push the boundaries, and Pon said a little bit, yes. They have had internal discussions of, for example, if Ra was released today, would he be viewed negatively? And the general consensus was that he might be received poorly initially, but when players actually got their hands on him, he would perform the same way he does now. There just might be some initial blowback on how simple his kit is, but Pon said it's also just fun for them to push boundaries a little from an artistic sense. Someone asked if he would ever be able to queue ranks with 5 people, and Kilgoon said probably not, because a full 5-man versus a non-full 5-man is heavily skewed in the 5-man's favor, and the likelihood that 2 separate 5-man squads of roughly equal skill level are in the queue at any one time is very low. Someone asked if there's any kind of ability that Pon has wanted to do but couldn't do due to design or balance constraints, and he said the main one would be basically Aladdin ult. He always wanted to make a 1v1 ult since early Smite 1, but he never could. But if he had to give an answer that's something that has literally never been done, he said probably Possession, which he originally tried for Baron, where you could like jump into someone and influence their movement while casting abilities from inside them, which sounds super interesting to me, but I can see where the design problems might come from there, as there would have to be some kind of counterplay or interaction, or it would feel extremely unfair for the person being possessed. People even complained about my man dash, and that's a much more neutered version of what he's describing here. There was a question of if they would essentially port Martikaros's kit to a different deity when they bring him over, and Kilgoon said he's potentially open to that idea, but Martikaros is probably a long ways away anyway. Someone asked about tier 2 items losing their passive when you upgrade them to tier 3, and Pon said they generally feel like that's okay as long as the passive relates in some way to what the tier 3 item is doing, such as Manchubo's on-hit damage building into tier 3s with on-hit effects, but they are aware that some tier 2 passives are completely unrelated to their tier 3s, and that's something they're going to look into changing in some way. Someone asked for a god roadmap when, and Kilgoon said they are of course aware of leaking Mercury on the PTS, but they said they're still going to wait until next week to give more details on the next few gods. And finally, there was a question of if they'll ever do Zeus shield aspect like in Smite 1, and Pon said they're aware that the community expects that from a Zeus aspect, and that's partly why he doesn't have one yet, since doing that will be a much larger arc of work with more things to consider than a typical aspect. Someone expanded on that to ask about old kits in general being brought back as aspects, and Pon said in a general sense probably not, as there's reasons those kits don't exist anymore, namely that they were problematic for the game. But that's everything discussed on today's Titan Talk. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss my future recaps, and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.